Victoria Harmon had never once left the office before 8. 14 years of building NorthBridge Capital from a 3-person startup into a mid-market firm managing 400 employees had wired her to the building. Her assistants changed. Her corner office got larger. The hours never did. She believed this was what leadership looked like. Presence, vigilance, sacrifice measured in sleep debt and skipped birthdays. She had a framed quote above her desk from some forgotten management guru. Results require residency, and she had never questioned it. That was before she started noticing Daniel Mercer. He was 34, a senior project analyst in the Midwest Operations Division. Solid record. Clean numbers. Nothing about him demanded attention except for one peculiarity that had started showing up in her administrative reports. Daniel Mercer clocked out at 6:07 p.m. every single day. Not 6, not 6:15, 6:07, with a reliability that made her think he'd programmed an alarm. She had noticed it first in a quarterly summary her HR director, Beverly Walsh, dropped on her desk in October. The firm was exploring a restructuring, trimming layers, consolidating roles, refocusing ambition toward people who wanted to grow. Beverly had flagged Daniel's file with a small red paperclip. He turns down every advancement opportunity, Beverly had said. Has for 3 years. No networking dinners, no conference travel, no weekend sprint sessions. We offered him the regional lead role in March, and he declined without explanation. Victoria had studied his performance reviews. Excellent across the board. Efficient, precise, respected by his team. But the pattern Beverly described was the pattern of someone disengaged, someone coasting on competence without ambition. She had set his file aside and told Beverly she'd think about it. Weeks passed. She kept watching the clock, not obsessively, but with a professional irritation she couldn't quite shake. Every evening at 6:07, she would glance toward the glass wall of her office and see Daniel Mercer's desk go dark. His jacket would be on, his computer screen black. His chair pushed precisely under his desk. He never rushed, never looked guilty, just left. The day she decided she needed to understand him began unremarkably. It was a Thursday in early November, cold and gray, the city outside her window already deep in its winter resignation. She had just come out of a brutal 2-hour board call, and her patience for ambiguity was at its thinnest. 6:07. The desk went dark. "Beverly," she said into her phone. "Pull everything we have on Daniel Mercer. Personal file. Emergency contacts. The works." She told herself it was due diligence. She told herself it was professional curiosity. She told herself a lot of things that evening. Victoria had never followed anyone before. The very concept would have struck the woman she was at 28 as absurd. She was a CEO. Not a private investigator, not a jealous spouse, not someone whose decisions were made in the passenger seat of a parked sedan. And yet, here she was. She'd told her driver to take the rest of the night off. She drove her own car, a dark gray Volvo she used on weekends when she wanted to feel like a person rather than a title. And she waited in the parking structure until she saw Daniel Mercer emerge through the side entrance at precisely 6:09. He walked quickly, not urgently, not anxiously, but with the focused stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had already calculated the time it would take to get there. He caught a city bus 2 blocks from the building. Victoria followed. She had half expected something revealing a second office, maybe, or a meeting with someone from a competitor. She'd had those situations before, had dealt with them professionally and without drama. She was prepared for betrayal. She understood betrayal. It had logic. What she was not prepared for was the neighborhood he stepped off in 40 minutes later. It was a working-class stretch of the city's western edge, not dangerous, not deteriorating, just old. Modest houses with small front yards. Chain-link fences. A corner store lit with fluorescent light. Cars that had been driven well past their first 100,000 miles. Daniel Mercer walked 2 blocks from the bus stop and turned up a short driveway toward a house with a green door. Victoria parked across the street. She sat in the dark and watched the porch light come on, and then the door opened. 3 girls. They launched off the porch before he'd even reached the top step, and they hit him like a wave, all arms and noise and complete, unguarded joy. He caught all 3, somehow, and staggered back half a step, laughing. They were young, maybe 5 or 6, identical in the particular way that made Victoria realize they were triplets. He set them down one at a time, kneeling on the cold concrete of the porch, checking each face like he was making sure nothing had changed in the 10 hours since he'd left. He fixed a ponytail. He asked a question Victoria couldn't hear. He listened to their answers with his full attention. Through the open door, she could see the inside of the house. It was small and clean and scattered with the evidence of childhood. A drawing taped to the wall, rain boots lined up by the door, a cardboard box construction project half-finished on the living room floor. No nanny, no housekeeper, no second adult visible anywhere. Daniel Mercer went inside, still wearing his work jacket, and within 15 minutes she could see him through the kitchen window standing at the stove, one of the girls on a step stool beside him, stirring something, the other 2 at the kitchen table with what looked like homework. He was pointing at something on a worksheet. One girl nodded. He smiled. Victoria had seen Daniel Mercer smile exactly twice in the office brief, polite, contained smiles that acknowledged a good result without celebrating it. This smile was different. It reached his eyes and changed his whole face. She realized she had been holding her breath. She also realized she had made approximately 12 serious misjudgments about this man in the past 6 months. She drove home in silence and did not put on the radio. She should have let it go at that. She had her answer. He wasn't disloyal. He wasn't coasting. He was a single father of 3 small children, and he left at 6-7 because that was when the neighbor who watched his daughters had to leave for her own evening shift. It explained everything. It changed nothing about the restructuring math, and yet she went back the next evening. She told herself she was just driving through the neighborhood. She told herself that particular lie for about 4 minutes before she parked in the same spot across the street. This time she noticed the details she'd missed before. The house needed paint around the window frames. One front step had a small crack running across it. In the driveway, a compact car with a broken taillight sat gathering the week's dead leaves. She watched Daniel carry the youngest girl inside, wrapped in a blanket she'd been asleep on the porch swing, apparently having fallen asleep waiting for him. He moved carefully, the way people move when they are terrified of waking something precious. Later, she had no excuse now. She was simply watching. She saw him at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed. He had a folder open. Medical invoices, she thought. The paper was the particular shade of institutional white that hospitals use. He sat with his elbows on the table and his hands folded in front of his face, looking at the numbers for a long time without moving. Victoria ran the personnel file again that night from her home office. She had access to the benefits usage data not for surveillance, she told herself, for restructuring planning. One of the 3 daughters, Charlotte, had a chronic respiratory condition that had required 2 hospitalizations in the past 18 months. The firm's coverage was good, but not complete. The gaps added up. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a while. She had spent her entire career believing that the people who sacrificed the most deserved the most. She had structured her company around that belief, and she had been on the verge of firing a man who was making a sacrifice she hadn't even recognized as sacrifice because it looked, from the outside, like a lack of ambition. It took her a long time to fall asleep. She started reading between the lines. The personnel file said, Daniel Mercer, hired 7 years ago as an analyst, promoted twice, consistently high-performing reviews, declined advancement opportunities in Year 4, Year 5, and Year 6. What it didn't say. His wife, Elaine, had died of an aneurysm 38 months ago. There was a death in family notation buried in the leave records. but nothing else. No explanation, no context, no acknowledgement of what it meant to show up for work 6 weeks later and keep being excellent at your job while also, somehow, becoming the only parent 3 two-year-olds had in the world. Victoria had been in a meeting in year 4. She looked it up. She found the notes where one of her division directors had described Daniel Mercer as talented but not hungry. She had agreed. She had nodded. She had moved on to the next slide. She thought about that now. She thought about a man who had lost his wife and rebuilt his life entirely around keeping 3 small children fed and safe and loved, who came to work every day and did his job well and asked for nothing and was described, in a conference room full of people who knew nothing about his life, as lacking hunger. She had a younger sister, Claire, who she rarely called. She had an apartment she'd never properly decorated because she was always going to get to it later. She had a storage unit full of her mother's things she hadn't sorted through since the funeral 4 years ago. She had been so busy building a life that she had not actually gotten around to living one. She sat with that realization for a long time. The collapse came in December. A major acquisition deal that NorthBridge had been working for 8 months fell apart on a Thursday morning when the target company's auditors surfaced a liability issue that nobody, not their lawyers, not their financial team, not Victoria's own advisors, had caught in time. The board called an emergency session. 2 major institutional investors began making threatening noises. The stock equivalent of their private equity positions dropped 14% in 2 days. Victoria had been through crises before. She was good at them. She cleared her calendar, moved into the firm's conference suite, and started working. It was Daniel who found the path through. He came to her office at 4 p.m. on a Friday, unusual. He almost never initiated contact with her directly and asked if he could show her something. He had spent 3 evenings analyzing the deal structure and had found an alternative configuration that restructured the acquisition as a phased partnership rather than an outright purchase. It eliminated the liability exposure entirely. It was elegant, it was technically sound, and it was something none of the senior advisors had proposed. "How long did this take you?" she asked, looking at the 40-page analysis he'd put together. "Evenings," he said. After the girls were asleep. She looked at him. The circles under his eyes, the slight fraying at the cuff of his shirt, the careful, measured way he held himself, like a man who had learned to carry a great deal without letting it show in his posture. "This is exceptional work, Daniel. Thank you." He stood up and reached for his jacket on the back of his chair. She checked the clock. It was 6:04. She let him go. She called him in on a Monday morning in January, early, before anyone else had arrived. She didn't know exactly what she planned to say. She had rehearsed several versions of the conversation over the weekend and discarded all of them. Daniel sat across from her desk in the chair that executives being evaluated always sat in, and he showed no particular sign of nervousness. He sat with his hands in his lap and his attention fully on her, the same way she'd seen him kneel on the porch and listen to his daughters. "I want to talk about your career here," she said. "All right, you've turned down 3 advancement opportunities in as many years. I'd like to understand why." He looked at her steadily. "You want the honest answer, or the professional one?" "The honest one, because the roles required travel and after-hours availability that I can't provide," he said. "My daughters are 6. One of them has a respiratory condition that means I need to be reachable at all times. I have coverage for the school day and until 6 in the evening. After that, I'm it." Victoria absorbed this. "You could have explained that," she said. "We might have been able to accommodate." "With respect," he said, and his voice was quiet but not uncertain. "The firm's culture doesn't accommodate. I've been here 7 years. I watched what happened to Marcus Ellison when he asked to modify his travel schedule after his mother got sick. I watched what happened to Jennifer Reese when she came back from maternity leave and needed reduced hours for 3 months. The firm moved around them and then moved on without them." Victoria did not argue with this. She couldn't. "I'm not asking for anything," Daniel continued. I'm not looking for sympathy. I come in, I do the work, I do it well, and I go home to my kids. That's the deal I've made with myself. But you're limiting your ceiling, she said. My ceiling, he said, is currently about 4 feet tall and answers to the name Charlotte. He said it without bitterness, without apology. Just as a fact about his life that he had made peace with. Victoria looked at her desk. She thought about the framed, quote, results require residency, and how long it had been since she'd actually read it, rather than just glanced past it. Thank you for your candor, she said. He nodded, reached for his jacket, and started toward the door. Daniel. She waited until he turned. The proposal you brought on the acquisition deal. It saved this firm a considerable amount of trouble. I want you to know that it was recognized at the board level. Something passed across his face, not quite surprise, not quite relief. Something more like the expression of a man who had been doing the right thing for a long time and had simply stopped expecting anyone to notice. I appreciate that, he said. And then he left. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in February. Victoria was in back-to-back meetings and almost didn't notice the flurry of activity outside her glass wall until she saw Beverly's face, pale, deliberate, the expression of someone carrying bad news toward a desk. Charlotte Mercer was admitted to St. Augustine's this morning, Beverly said. Respiratory crisis. Daniel left at 11:30. She hesitated. He didn't ask. He just told me and left. I wanted you to know before HR flagged it. Victoria looked at her calendar. 3 more meetings. A call with the board. She stood up, took her coat from the rack behind her door, and told her assistant to reschedule everything. She told herself she was not sure why she was doing this. The drive to St. Augustine's took 22 minutes. She sat in the hospital parking lot for 5 minutes, trying to identify a professional rationale for her presence and failing to find one. She went in anyway. She found Daniel in a waiting area on the pediatric floor, sitting with the other 2 girls on either side of him. They were quiet in the way children are quiet when they sense that the adults around them are frightened. One of them, the one with the red beret, was drawing in a small sketchbook. The other had her head against Daniel's shoulder and her eyes half closed. Daniel looked up when he heard her steps. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't her. Victoria, he said. He stood automatically, some workplace instinct kicking in. Sit down, she said. Please. Stable now. They've got her on a nebulizer. It was, he paused, sat back down. It was bad this morning. She sat in the chair across from him. The girl with the red beret looked at her with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Are you Daddy's boss? She asked. Yes, Victoria said. I am. He talks about work sometimes, the girl said. He says the people there work very hard. Some of them do, Victoria said. He works very hard too, the girl said, with the particular seriousness of a 6-year-old making a case. He just also has to be home for dinner. Victoria glanced at Daniel. He was looking at his hands. An hour later, a hospital administrator came with paperwork about a billing shortfall, a gap between the coverage estimate and the actual procedure cost, running to nearly $3,000. He was explaining payment plans when Victoria reached into her coat and set her card on the clipboard. No, Daniel said immediately. She met his eyes. Daniel, no. His voice was steady. I don't need charity. I'll manage it. It isn't charity. What is it then? She thought about that. She thought about a long time. It's me acknowledging that this firm has taken more from you than it ever gave back. It's me saying that should have been different. She stopped. It's me saying I'm sorry. The ward was very quiet around them. The girl with the red beret had stopped drawing and was watching with the solemn attention of a witness. Daniel looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked down at his daughters. Then he looked at the administrator and gave a small, tired nod. She started with the policy review in the first week of March. It wasn't a grand gesture. She had not been converted by a single epiphany into a different person. She was still demanding, still direct, still the same woman who had built this firm by refusing to accept mediocrity. But she was looking at the machinery differently now, not at what it produced, but at what it consumed. She brought in a consultant, a woman named Dr. Patricia Flynn, who had spent 20 years studying workplace retention and burnout, and told her to be brutal. Patricia was. The report she produced at the end of 4 weeks was the most uncomfortable document Victoria had ever read about her own company. The changes were structural, not symbolic. Flexible scheduling became a documented option for every department, with clear guidelines rather than vague promises. A subsidized childcare arrangement was negotiated with a provider 3 blocks from the office. A confidential emergency assistance fund was established for employees facing medical or family crises, funded jointly by the firm, and a voluntary executive contribution program that Victoria seated herself. The board pushed back, as boards do. One board member, a man named Gerald Ashton, who had been in private equity for 30 years, called the childcare provision a distraction from core business objectives in a board meeting. Victoria looked at him across the table. "Gerald," she said, "we lost 11 high-performing analysts in the past 2 years. 7 of them cited caregiving obligations in their exit interviews. Our competitor, Ridgeway, introduced a family support program 18 months ago, and their analyst retention rate jumped 9%. She paused. "Would you like me to keep going, or shall we vote?" They voted. The measures passed. She sent an all-company note the following Monday. It was 3 paragraphs long. It did not use the words innovation or culture or journey. It said, plainly, that the firm was changing some of the ways it operated, that it had not always made it easy for good people to stay, and that this was going to be different. Beverly stopped her in the hallway afterward. "People are talking," she said. "I know." Their Beverly seemed to be searching for the right word. They're surprised. But in a good way, like they weren't sure anyone was actually paying attention. "Someone should have been paying attention a long time ago," Victoria said. She kept walking. April came slowly that year, the way it does after a hard winter. The city was still deciding whether to commit to warmth. Victoria was at her desk at 5:50 on a Thursday when she looked up and saw Daniel Mercer beginning his end-of-day ritual screen shut down, jacket on, chair pushed in, all with the same quiet efficiency it had always had. She was at her office door before she fully decided to be. "Daniel," he looked up, "go ahead and leave at 5:30 tomorrow. The system will show it as regular hours." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not necessary. I know it isn't necessary." She leaned against the doorframe. "Consider it the firm acknowledging something that should have been acknowledged a long time ago." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. "Thank you, Victoria." It was the first time he'd used her name. The following Saturday, she drove to his neighborhood not to watch, not to investigate, not for any professional reason at all. She had called ahead. She had spoken to Daniel. He had said, after a pause long enough that she'd wondered if she'd misjudged everything, "The girls have been asking about you." She parked in the same spot she'd parked in on those November evenings. The house looked different in April light. The front step had been repaired, new concrete, still paler than the old. The window frames had a fresh coat of paint, white against the weathered wood. The small yard had the tentative green of early spring. She walked up the path and knocked. The door opened immediately, as if they'd been watching for her. All 3 girls stood in the doorway in a row, in descending order of height. The one with the red beret, whose name Victoria had learned, was Hazel, looked up at her with complete directness. "You came," Hazel said. "I came," Victoria said. "Dad said you might not." "Hazel," Daniel said, from somewhere behind them, his voice the particular kind of tired and fond that only parents of young children ever achieve. "It's true," Hazel said, unrepentant. Victoria stepped inside. The house was warm and smelled like something baking. The cardboard construction project from November had been replaced by a new one. a structure that appeared to be either a spaceship or a very ambitious dog kennel. It was hard to say. Charlotte was on the couch with a book in her lap, looking up with curious eyes. She was smaller than the others, but her color was good. She looked, Victoria thought, like a child getting enough rest. "She's the smart one," Hazel informed Victoria confidentially. "But don't tell the others I said that." The third girl, Rosie, who had been the one drawing in the hospital, handed Victoria a folded piece of paper without explanation and then disappeared into the kitchen. Victoria opened it. It was a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a tall woman in a gray coat, standing next to a shorter man and 3 small figures. Above them, in large, careful letters. Victoria looked at it for a moment. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Daniel appeared from the kitchen drying his hands on a dish towel, a completely unremarkable gesture that nonetheless made him look more like himself than he ever did in the office. "Sorry about the art critic," he said. "Don't apologize," Victoria said. "It's the best review I've ever received." He smiled. Not the contained office smile. The real one. The one that reached his eyes. They ate dinner at a table too small for the 5 of them, with mismatched plates and a conversation that moved without warning between the structural integrity of the cardboard spaceship, Charlotte's book about deep-sea creatures, and Hazel's current feud with a classmate named Owen. Victoria contributed more to the conversation than she expected to. After dinner, Daniel made the girls clear the table while he made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table while the sound of the girls arguing over a board game drifted in from the living room. Victoria wrapped her hands around her mug. "The proposal for the regional restructuring," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I want you to lead it. The whole initiative. You designed the framework. You should be the one to implement it. We'll structure the role to be home-based when it can be. Travel only when it's actually necessary, not out of habit." He was quiet. "The compensation will reflect the scope," she added. "And the benefits package will be revised to cover Charlotte's treatment more completely. That's being fixed, regardless for all employees in similar situations, but I wanted you to know specifically." He turned his coffee mug a half rotation, turned it back. "Why are you telling me this here?" he asked. "You could have done this in the office." She thought about that. "Because the office is where I would have told you a year ago." I was trying to say something different now. He looked at her. "I spent 14 years believing that the building was where life happened," she said. "That the hours you put in were the measure of how seriously you took things. I was wrong. I just needed." She paused. "I needed someone to show me what I was missing." The board game argument in the other room reached some kind of crescendo and then resolved abruptly into laughter. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You should know that Charlotte calls you the CEO lady. I heard Hazel's version. Hazel's version is more diplomatic than Charlotte's, actually." Victoria laughed. It surprised her. She drove home late, later than 6, 7, later than 8, later than she usually let herself stay anywhere that wasn't work. The city was quiet and bright. She had Rosie's drawing in her coat pocket and the smell of someone else's kitchen in her hair. She thought about the framed quote above her desk. She thought about taking it down. She thought about what she might put in its place, if anything. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the wall, and the window, and the light. She thought about the fact that success, real success, the kind that held its shape over a whole life and not just a quarter, had nothing to do with being the last one to turn out the lights. It had to do with having a door worth coming home to. At 6:07 p.m. the following Monday, Daniel Mercer picked up his jacket and pushed in his chair. Victoria was already in the elevator.